recently was in a conversation with a guy I know about cult classic films of the last 30 years. And we listed off a whole bunch, not necessarily films that we personally liked, but he brought up one film, which was Gattaca, and I had to take issue with that. Not in the sense that it's not a cult classic, it sort of is. 1997 is almost 30 years old, and people talk about it a lot, and it's basically a meme, at least in the circles of people who are familiar with the film. But I really, really dislike Gattaca, intensely dislike Gattaca, for a variety of reasons. And he asked me why. And I basically told him that it's the worst version of the Underdog's tale. It's the Underdog's tale that doesn't make any sense. From top to bottom, it makes no sense. Now, I get along with this guy pretty well. We have conversations about video games and other things, and we're on decent terms. There's no hostility there. But I basically enunciated to him that, look, typically, when you have an Underdog's tale, the underdog is actually competent. The guy who's overthrowing the tyrannical king, or whatever it might be, Rocky Balboa, beating off the technologically more advanced Soviet Drago, these guys are competent at root, at base. But the character of Vincent in Gattaca is anything but competent, and we'll get into that in a bit. And inevitably and invariably, we ended up in a conversation about genetics, and it turned out this guy is very much a blank slatist. Not a hostile, aggressive, antagonistic one, I would say, which was nice. So we were able to talk about it, but he basically made the sales pitch to me that everyone is interchangeable, essentially. For example, he is very good at investment, and he's accumulated a good amount of wealth through playing the stock market and this sort of thing, which is a legitimate skill. And he was claiming that you could take anyone and swap him out for them, and they could do the exact same thing. Now, of course, this makes absolutely no sense if you think about it logically, even if you don't know all the details about genetics, never read a study. Are people really one-to-one interchangeable? I think it's fairly obvious that that's not the case. But he didn't believe that. And so I had to start using extreme examples. You start with the extreme examples when you're having these types of Socratic conversations, if you will, and you move down the line from the extreme to the more moderate and normal examples. So I asked him, do you think that a person with Down syndrome could be an effective stock market player, an investor? And so he shifted the goalpost a little bit and said, well, as long as they're mentally all there and don't have some profound mental disability. I had to point out to him, not in a vindictive way, that he said that anyone can do what he's doing and that all people are interchangeable. That would include, of course, people that are severely mentally challenged, including Down syndrome individuals. And then we moved on from that example, and I said, let's take another example, a physical one. Do you think somebody who is 4'2" could be an effective basketball player in the NBA? And he had to concede no, but that's about the physicality. It's about the physical. Then I asked him, do you think you could take anyone off the street, virtually anyone, and train them to become either an Olympic-class sprinter or a long-distance runner? And he says possibly, but he's not sure. Again, that's the physical realm. But when it comes to mental tasks and mental abilities, anyone can do anything if they apply themselves, and everybody's interchangeable. So I used the classic one. Do you think anyone could be an Einstein? Anyone can study university-level physics and understand it well. You see what I was trying to engage in, a kind of friendly drilling down on the topic. And I even presented some studies to him and asked him just to read the abstracts, a paragraph. And in the end, he just said to me, even if you came out with 100 studies and all of them prove that my position is wrong, I would still believe in the blank slate because I want to believe in the blank slate. Now, on the one hand, I sort of respect this position. It's very rare, for example, that you get people who are, say, of religious bent, who will concede that they don't actually have good evidence for their beliefs, but they believe anyway. Occasionally you do, but it's not very frequent. And in this case, this guy said, look, I don't really have good evidence for my beliefs necessarily, but I want to believe. I want to believe in the stories of the crack babies that grew up in abusive households who became successful businessmen and professors and this sort of thing. Because he finds that inspirational, he says to me. And I tell him there's actually a converse of the inspiration. There's a demotivation that can stem from that as well, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's return to Gattaca for the moment. What is my issue with Gattaca? You have this guy Vincent in the society where everybody is essentially genetically designed, programmed, and his parents, for ridiculous reasons, elect to not give him the typical advantages that everybody has in the society and conceive naturally without any intervention on the part of the state or technology. And Vincent is born with horrible issues with the heart, and congenital risks of dying at around the age of 32 or something. He's basically pre-programmed in the most probabilistic, likely way to fail very early on in life. This is made clear in the film, and it's stated at the level of his genome that this is the case. Now, he has a brother who wasn't conceived this way, because the parents later apparently regretted their decision. And Vincent and his brother used to go to the shore all the time and swim out to the sea, and his brother would always beat him, until one fateful day, Vincent woke up and said, "By golly gee shucks, I'm going to beat my brother this time." And he did. And not only does he beat his brother is exhausted and collapsed, and he rescues his brother. And isn't this amazing, one instance of a guy putting his mind to it and doing the seemingly impossible? Of course, the main premise of the film is Vincent aspiring to be an astronaut, a space explorer. And he gets involved in this association or friendship with a guy who was genetically blessed, had been a swimmer but had an accident, and was crippled from the legs down. And he engages in the subterfuge at the local place where he's working, where he's a janitor, using the other guy's DNA to pass various tests, so he ultimately can become the astronaut space explorer that he wants to be. And of course, he succeeds, beating the odds. And if I recall correctly, in the film, they claim it's something like a 90% plus chance that he will die of heart failure before 35 or something like that. What's the problem with this? This isn't inspirational. This is comical and ludicrous. And in contrast to something like a Rocky Balboa, who's training naturally and isn't abusing technology and who knows what else, at least in the film, let's say. And he's training in the cold wilderness of Siberia versus Drago, who has state-of-the-art government-sponsored technology testing his abilities. Rocky is the underdog, but he's always been good at what he's done, and he's proven time and again that he's an amazing boxer. There's no such evidence in the case of Vincent. Okay, he rescued his brother and he beat him once at a swim. Which again, after losing 99% of the time, you suddenly wake up and say, I'm not going to lose. To just repeat this point, I get why people like underdogs and the underdog story, but the underdog is almost never that disadvantaged in that sense. He's almost always competent at what he's doing. It's just that his competence hasn't been recognized. But here we have a film that states quite officially that this guy has every disadvantage under the sun compared to his fellow citizens who have been genetically endowed through pre-selection. From heads to tails, it makes no sense whatsoever. And what's the issue here in terms of inspiration, when I talked about the converse, is that for every crack baby from an abusive household that becomes a professional businessman, athlete, or professor, you have scores, the vast majority of these people, crack babies, who fail. So where is the inspiration here? Looking at exceptions, focusing on survivorship bias, and then feeling inspired by that. And maybe some people are inspired, and they attempt to do their best under the circumstances presented to them, because Vincent inspired them, or the guy that grew up as a crack baby and became a professional football player or a businessman. This guy inspired them too. But again, the converse is accusatory fingers being pointed at you when you don't achieve what these other guys achieved. And why didn't you? Because you didn't put in the work, you didn't put in the effort. Of course, normies, I hate to use the term these days, but normies don't separate hard work from genetics. As I pointed out a number of times, there's very good evidence and there are very good data showing that your ability to work hard is at least 50% based on the genes you've been given, maybe even more, and that's a big part of it. So your conscientiousness and your ambition has a large genetic component. And then you might argue some people are harder, they might need to put in more work, but ultimately they can do the same thing. Again, to bring up the salient point about the environment, the time when the environment is most influential is the ages of 0 to, say, 18, when you have the least control over your life. And when all the gene expression that you're getting from the environment, you have no control over that. So the switch people think exists is not really a thing, and you can't turn it on and off like people claim. First, you have the genetic component, which is at least half, and then you have all the formative experiences in your environment, basically when you're a kid or a teenager, when you have the least control in your life. I know I might sound like a broken record, but it's important to hammer this point home. And finally, we come to David Goggins, who's a perfect example of this false inspiration, for many of the reasons I've cited. So David Goggins will tell people how, before he became a Navy SEAL and a hardcore endurance athlete, perhaps even the most hardcore endurance athlete in the world, he was fat and lazy. He has pictures. If you look at these pictures, he was pretty fat. He wasn't really obese. He was very overweight. But he'll tell you, and people who feel inspired and support him, that he just woke up one day and wanted to change things. And that's a thought that people have. People do wake up one day and want to change things, and sometimes they do. But what he won't tell you is that he had a prolific career, as it were, in high school, playing basketball and other sports, and spent much of his childhood engaging in rigorous athletic and sporting activity. So essentially, when you look at that picture of him, which I think is in his late 20s, he took a break from all of that. But the lion's share of his formative years, before that, he was very fit, he was very athletic, as evidenced by the fact that he was an effective basketball player, and he'd always played sports in his childhood well into his teenage years. And that has a massive effect in the sense that you already have natural talent combined by practice and experience. So he didn't go from zero to hero, as he likes to claim, and other people like to claim about him too. He didn't wake up one day and said, I'm going to become a Navy SEAL and become the greatest endurance athlete ever. He basically had 2 decades of his youth, of his best years, preparing to do that. And yes, he got fat and out of shape for a few years, but that's nothing in comparison to the background that he had as an athlete and as a youth. And on top of all that, you can't do all those sports and excel at these things and not have some genetic gifts. What David Goggins does at the level of the mind, mentality, and what he does physically are both genetic endowments. He clearly has the capacity to push himself to limits that other people cannot. Not because they don't want to, as he likes to claim and other people like to claim, but because they just don't have the same psychology. They weren't endowed with the same psychology. And physically, I think very few people could achieve what he's achieved to the same extent at the same level. Now, I'll grant you that people can feel inspired and improve their physical fitness and lose weight, and these are great things, but that's not what David Goggins advertises. David Goggins, the David Goggins effect is anyone can do it. They just need to want to do it. That's the problem, right? They need to want to do it. It's kind of like the Ronnie Coleman meme. Everybody want to be a bodybuilder, but ain't nobody want to lift any heavy-ass weight. Especially in the realm of bodybuilding, most people cannot lift the quote-unquote heavy-ass weight that Ronnie Coleman used to lift. Kind of a separate discussion, but related. So when people are inspired, to what degree are they inspired to think that they can achieve exactly the same thing? You're never going to be somebody else. And somebody else has a different genome, has a different life history, a different environment that they grew into and grew up in. So if by inspiration you mean David Goggins or take your pick of some celebrity or famous person that likes to make big claims about how everyone is capable of doing X, if that inspires you to lose weight and feel better about yourself and maybe improve your cardiovascular fitness, good for you. You get people that actually think they can achieve exactly what these prophets of achievement have achieved. And these people are all exceptional individuals. And to get back to the original conversation with the guy, no, not everyone can just wake up, learn the stock market, and learn how to invest effectively and profitably. Some people can, but we're not all interchangeable. And ultimately, this comes down to what you think is more harmful. I personally think the blank slate philosophy, ideology, is a lot more harmful than accepting the now excellent wealth of data that we have at our fingertips that tells us we are all different, genes play a huge role in our lives, and Gattaca is an idiotic film precisely because this guy had every genetic disadvantage possible and he still succeeded. Yes, I get the point of Gattaca. It's trying to talk about the evils of a eugenic society and what have you, blah, blah, blah. But you're never going to have a Down syndrome person become a professor of physics or mathematics, even a professor of history. Just like you're never going to have somebody who doesn't have the requisite musculature to become a world-class long-distance runner or a cyclist. We're all different. And unfortunately, and this is the bitter truth, I think, it's not that things even out. It's not the case. Sometimes you can be born with so many genetic disadvantages that the best you could achieve is maybe what Vincent does, which is be a janitor and sweep the floor. That's not everybody. That's probably not even a majority. But I will pound this message home until I'm dead. The blank slate ideology is delusional, 1. 2, is harmful, because for every inspiration people feel, there are thousands of examples of lack of inspiration and demotivation, and people being crushed by the delusions that were thrust upon them because of blank slate ideology. So all I can say is, I hope we come to a point in society, and I hope to still be alive at that time, when the mountains of evidence presented to us, broadly, that genes are the most important salient factor in your life, when these mountains of evidence become so irresistible that everyone has to accept these things, regardless of what their former position was, because they would appear as lunatics if they did otherwise. That is my hope for the future. Now, mind you, I'm not very hopeful on this, but I do think it's possible. Not very possible, but possible. And so I say in closing, down with the blank slate. As always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are the best. Without you, the channel could not exist. And many special thanks to my donors on PayPal. You guys are essential as well. Thank you very much indeed for donating. And as for everybody else, if you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, all that YouTube jazz would be much appreciated. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. Thank you regardless. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.